Keanu Reeves was cruising through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, the deep rumble of his Norton Commando 961 cutting through the still night. The city was asleep, its neon lights flickering against the damp pavement as early morning fog curled around the empty sidewalks. For Keanu, these late-night rides were a ritual, his escape from the weight of fame, the constant expectations, and the noise of the world. But tonight, something would shatter that solitude in a way he never expected. At first, it was just a passing blur, a lone figure wrapped in a tattered blanket, slumped against the wall of a closed shop. Another lost soul in the city, another shadow blending into the forgotten corners of Los Angeles. But something made him hesitate. Something made his chest tighten. His hands instinctively eased the brakes as his mind raced. Was it the way she sat, too still, too withdrawn? Or was it the way her frail fingers clutched at the filthy fabric as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world? He almost kept going. Almost convinced himself it was nothing. But a force stronger than logic made him turn the bike around. The headlight cast a soft glow over the fragile silhouette, and as he stepped closer, pulling off his gloves, a cold dread crept into his bones. His pulse quickened. He knew this face. Even through the wrinkles, the tangled gray hair, the exhaustion carved into her features, he knew her. Mrs. Collins. His voice barely broke the silence, hesitant, disbelieving. The woman flinched at the sound, her dull, weary eyes lifting to meet his. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Recognition flickered through the haze of her gaze, but before she could speak, her body gave way. Keanu lunged forward, catching her just before she collapsed onto the cold pavement. She was too light, too fragile, his mind flooded with questions, but this wasn't the time for answers. Her breathing was shallow, her frame trembling from exhaustion or cold, maybe both. He glanced around, the streets were empty. What happened next wouldn't just change his night. It would unearth a painful past he could never ignore. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow, we have another special story just for you. Only a few distant cars passed by, their headlights slicing through the quiet Los Angeles night. The faint wail of a siren echoed somewhere in the distance, blending into the soft hum of flickering streetlights. Keanu's mind raced. He had no plan, no idea what to do next. Instinct took over as he crouched down, gently helping the frail woman sit upright, propping her against the cold brick wall. "Can you hear me?" His voice was low but firm. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling to focus. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into her face, dark circles beneath her eyes, deep lines carved by years of hardship. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Keanu." His name came out in a breath, shaky, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure if he was real or just another ghost from a fading memory. Keanu swallowed hard, forcing a small reassuring smile despite the tightness in his chest. "It's me, Mrs. Collins. It's really me." The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken emotions. He could see it in her eyes, the way her mind struggled to catch up, to understand why, after all these years, he was standing in front of her. And then, something shifted. Recognition. For a brief moment, Keanu wasn't on the cold streets of Los Angeles. He was a boy again, standing on a school stage, nervous, clutching a script in his sweaty hands. He could still hear her voice in his mind. On stage, you never hide. You feel. You live. And then, just as quickly, he was back in the present, staring at the woman who had once taught him everything he knew about acting. Only now, she was unrecognizable. His throat tightened. How had this happened? "Is it really you?" he finally asked. She let out a shaky breath, her voice brittle. "I think so." Her words were fragile, carrying the weight of lost years. Keanu hesitated. There was so much he wanted to ask. So many questions flooding his mind. But something told him he had to tread carefully. She tried to shift, but her body refused to cooperate. A shiver ran through her frail frame, and without thinking, Keanu slipped off his leather jacket, draping it over her shoulders. She flinched at the sudden warmth, but didn't resist. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" she murmured. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, it has." But no amount of time could have prepared him for this moment. Mrs. Collins rubbed a shaky hand over her face, as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. Her gaze dropped to the ground, her fingers tightening around the filthy blanket. Keanu saw it then, the hesitation. The shame. She didn't want to be seen like this. But he saw her. Before he could stop himself, the words slipped from his lips. "What happened to you?" The silence that followed was sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. Mrs. Collins lowered her head, her thin hands clutching the blanket tighter against her chest. Keanu could feel the weight of it all, the story she wasn't saying, the pain buried in everything left unspoken. He waited. And finally, after what felt like forever, she whispered something that sent a cold wave through him. "I tried, Keanu." Her voice cracked, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I tried." Tried what? What had she been fighting for? But before he could ask, her body suddenly gave out again. She collapsed forward, and this time, Keanu caught her firmly, his arms wrapping around her fragile frame. She was too weak to hold herself up. He couldn't leave her like this. His mind raced. His heart pounded. Keanu knew one thing for certain: this night was far from over. Silence hung between them, heavier than any words. Mrs. Collins hesitated, her tired eyes fixed on the empty street ahead, as if searching for something, maybe the right words, maybe a way to soften the truth. And then, finally, she spoke. "I lost my job when they cut the theater program." Keanu had suspected something like that, but hearing it from her made it real. "I tried to keep going. I gave private lessons, took small jobs where I could. But things started to fall apart. The bills piled up. The city swallowed me whole." She paused, her gaze drifting into the past, into memories that seemed too painful to relive all at once. "At first, I thought it was temporary, just a rough patch. I kept telling myself I'd find something new, that life would go back to normal. But the months passed, and suddenly, I had no home." Keanu felt a knot tighten in his throat. He had always known life could be unforgiving, but he had never imagined this. "I spent some time couch surfing, staying with people who still cared. But doors started closing. People get tired. No one wants a long-term problem in their life." Keanu knew that was true. The world could be merciless. Mrs. Collins rubbed her hands together as if trying to shake off a cold that had settled deep inside her bones. And then, before I realized it, it was too late. Keanu's chest ached. He thought of everything she had meant to him, how she had once been his guiding light, the person who helped him find his voice when he was just a nervous kid standing on a stage. And now, here she was. Alone. Broken. He wanted to say something, to tell her that none of this changed who she was. But before he could, she murmured, almost to herself, "The hardest part isn't losing things. It's losing people." She pressed her lips together as if holding something even heavier inside. Then, her voice dropped lower, trembling. "I pushed everyone away, Keanu. The few who still cared. Because I didn't want to be a burden." A chill ran through him. He knew that feeling. That creeping sense that you're dragging people down, that it's better to disappear than to become someone else's problem. He knew that shadow all too well. But seeing it in her, that hurt in a way he wasn't prepared for. And then she said something that made his heartbeat quicken. "And I made a mistake I can't undo." She didn't explain. But Keanu caught the hesitation in her voice, the weight behind her words. There was something else. Something she wasn't ready to say. The silence stretched between them. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, trying to think, trying to find the right words. He wanted to ask the right questions, but he knew he couldn't push. So instead, he simply said, his voice firm, "You're not a burden to me. Mrs. Collins closed her eyes and looked away. You say that now. Keanu shook his head. I say that because it's true. She let out a long, slow breath, like she wanted to believe him, but couldn't. And then he asked the question he had been avoiding. The one he knew he had to ask. What about your children? The air between them shifted. Mrs. Collins tensed. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, They tried to help me. For a while. Keanu felt those words hit like a cold wave. For a while. Why wasn't she with them now? What had happened? Before he could ask, Mrs. Collins's gaze drifted back to the empty street, lost in a place far from this moment. And for the first time that night, Keanu saw something in her eyes that unsettled him, a silent darkness. A pain too deep for words. Something far worse than he had imagined. And he hadn't even heard the full story yet. Her words hung in the air like a knife, suspended, waiting to fall. They did what they could, she finally continued, her voice distant. They helped when things started to fall apart. Her fingers moved slowly, as if tracing the edges of a life that had slipped through them. But after a while, I pushed them away. Keanu frowned. Why? She let out a short, hollow laugh. Because I didn't want to be a burden. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. That feeling, it was one he knew too well. But still, it didn't make sense. And they just accepted that? Mrs. Collins hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, Not right away. They tried. They gave me options. But I refused. She bit her lower lip, her breath unsteady. After a while, they stopped insisting. Keanu felt his chest tighten. He tried to picture it, her children, faces he had never seen, reaching out, trying to pull her back from the edge. And her, slipping further away, shutting them out. Until, finally, silence. Not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. And yet, he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. Something she wasn't saying. And whatever it was the reason she was here. Keanu couldn't wrap his head around it, how someone like Mrs. Collins had been left behind by the world. Do they still know where you are? He asked. She shrugged, barely meeting his eyes. I doubt it. He frowned. You don't talk to them? She shook her head. There's nothing left to say. Her voice was dry, final. But Keanu didn't believe that. There was still so much left unsaid. The silence between them stretched, and that's when he noticed it. When the sleeve of her tattered coat slipped slightly, a thin, pale scar became visible, stretching along her forearm. A knot formed in Keanu's stomach. Mrs. Collins realized he had seen it, but she didn't move to cover it. She just looked at him, and in that look, there was a warning. Don't ask. Keanu pressed his lips together. He wanted to. He needed to. But a part of him already knew the answer, and for now, he wasn't sure she was ready to talk about it. So instead, he said, steady and certain, I'm here now. Mrs. Collins let out a short laugh. And what difference does that make? Keanu met her gaze. It means you're not alone anymore. She blinked, as if those words were too difficult to process. But before she could respond, something broke the stillness of the night, footsteps. Keanu turned instinctively. Mrs. Collins did the same. A shadow moved beneath the dim streetlights. A man in loose, dirty clothes, his tired eyes locked onto them. He stopped a few feet away. Hey, his voice was rough. Got a cigarette? Mrs. Collins shook her head. I don't smoke. The man glanced at Keanu. Keanu didn't move, didn't flinch, his posture was relaxed, but his eyes stayed sharp. The man shrugged and kept walking. Mrs. Collins exhaled slowly. Don't trust anyone around here. She looked at Keanu. You should go. He raised an eyebrow. And leave you here alone? She chuckled lightly. I'm not as fragile as I look. Keanu narrowed his eyes. No. But you're not invincible either. She didn't answer. The wind blew again, lifting dust from the sidewalk. Keanu knew this night wasn't over. Mrs. Collins had more to tell, more to reveal, whether she wanted to or not. And he wasn't leaving. He had no idea how long they had been sitting there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. The city of Los Angeles remained cold, indifferent. You should go, she said again, her voice quiet but firm. Keanu crossed his arms, leaning against the wall beside her. I won't. She let out a tired sigh. Keanu, don't even try to convince me. Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. Exasperation. Resistance. Maybe something deeper. Were you always this stubborn? Keanu smirked. I learned from a certain teacher. She lowered her head and let out a short, humorless laugh. The silence between them lingered. Mrs. Collins pulled the blanket tighter around herself, shrinking slightly. Keanu could see it, how exhausted she was, how the cold had drained her. But more than that, he saw something deeper. She didn't want help. Or rather, she didn't believe she deserved it. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He looked around. The streets were empty, but the city never truly slept. His voice was serious now. You can't stay here all night. She lifted her eyes to him. And what do you suggest? Keanu hesitated, thinking fast. A hotel? No, she would refuse. His house? She would never accept. Then, an idea. A cafe. She blinked, caught off guard. What? Keanu shrugged. Nothing fancy. Just a warm place. Coffee. Food. You can rest for a bit. She opened her mouth to refuse, but Keanu spoke first. 1 hour. Then you decide what to do. Mrs. Collins pressed her lips together, torn. He could see the battle happening inside her. Accepting meant admitting she needed help. But refusing meant spending the night on that cold piece of concrete. Finally, she sighed. 1 hour. Keanu let out a small smile. Deal. The bell on the cafe doors jingled as they stepped inside. It was a quiet, unassuming place, warm, with a few scattered customers hunched over steaming mugs, the soft murmur of conversation filling the air. Keanu led Mrs. Collins to a corner table. She walked slowly, as if every step took effort. Once they sat down, a waiter approached. What can I get you? Keanu looked at Mrs. Collins, waiting for her to order. She hesitated. She wasn't used to choosing. So he did it for her. 2 coffees. And whatever's the warmest, most filling thing on the menu. The waiter nodded and walked away. Mrs. Collins studied him. Have you always had this instinct to save people? Keanu shrugged. I just do what feels right. She sighed, running a hand through her messy but clean hair. Sometimes, people don't want to be saved. Keanu held her gaze. Sometimes, they just think they can't be. Silence settled between them again. When the coffee arrived, Mrs. Collins wrapped both hands around the cup, her fingers tightening around the warmth as if absorbing it into her bones. She closed her eyes. And for the first time that night, she looked like she might let herself rest. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this keep you hooked, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow, we have another one you won't want to miss. As Mrs. Collins lifted the cup to her lips, Keanu watched her closely. In that moment, she seemed so small, as if the weight of the world had pressed her into something fragile. So much had been taken from her, years of struggle had etched themselves into her face, worn her down in ways no one should ever have to endure. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the pain, he saw something else. A spark. Faint, barely visible, but still there. Then, breaking the silence, she spoke. You want to ask about the scar, don't you? The question caught Keanu off guard. His instinct was to deny it, to tell her no. But he was a terrible liar. I do. She lowered her eyes to the table, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with trembling fingers. The seconds stretched between them before she finally found her voice. I was at my lowest point, Keanu. Worse than now. He held his breath. I didn't see a way out. I didn't think it was worth trying. A chill ran down Keanu's spine. She didn't need to say more. He understood. The scar wasn't just a mark on her skin. It was a moment, one where she had almost let go. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the cup as if anchoring herself to the present. But I'm here. Somehow. Keanu watched her for a long time before he spoke. His voice was quiet but certain. I'm glad you are. She lifted her eyes, surprised. And for a brief moment, something shifted in her expression. Something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Mrs. Collins looked down at her coffee, lost in thought. Her fingers toyed with the handle, her mind drifting somewhere far away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Why are you doing this, Keanu?" He didn't answer right away. He just held her gaze. "Because you did it for me first." Silence settled between them, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of regret. It wasn't the silence of pain. It was a silence filled with possibilities. The first step had been taken, but the road ahead was still long. The coffee in Mrs. Collins's hands was still warm, but she didn't drink it. She simply held onto the cup, as if its heat could tether her to something real. Keanu watched her in silence. He knew this night had been a turning point, not just for her, but for him too. She had finally spoken about the pain, about the scar, about the weight of the choices that had led her here. But now came the hardest part. Accepting real help. Mrs. Collins let out a sigh and set the cup down on the table. And now, Keanu? He straightened his posture. Now, you let me help. She let out a quiet, tired laugh, shaking her head. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Keanu met her gaze, unwavering. By taking you somewhere you can start over. Mrs. Collins exhaled sharply, almost a scoff. It's not that simple. Why not? She opened her mouth, ready to argue, ready to list all the reasons why it wouldn't work. But she hesitated. And Keanu saw it. For the first time, she wasn't entirely sure about refusing. He knew he was close to breaking the invisible barrier she had built around herself. He took a deep breath. I found you by chance tonight. But now that I have, I won't just walk away. Mrs. Collins turned her gaze to the window. I don't want to be your responsibility, Keanu. It's not about responsibility. He leaned forward slightly. It's about choice. She blinked, caught off guard. Choice? Yeah. You chose to help so many students in the past. You chose to believe in me when I doubted myself. Now it's my turn to believe in you. She swallowed hard. The truth was, no one had spoken to her like this in a long time. Her voice was barely a whisper. And what if I fail? Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. And what if you don't? Mrs. Collins fell silent. That was it. The question she had never allowed herself to ask. She had spent so much time believing she was already lost, that she had already failed. But now, for the first time in years, someone was asking, what if you're not? Slowly, as if testing the words, she murmured, what do you have in mind? Keanu didn't hide his smile. A support center for homeless women. They offer recovery programs, therapy, housing assistance, job referrals. She frowned slightly. And you think I belong there? Keanu raised an eyebrow. I think you deserve a second chance. Mrs. Collins stayed silent, the battle inside her visible. But then, after a long moment, she nodded. It was barely a movement, but Keanu saw it. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's try." The city was still sleeping as Keanu drove. Not on his motorcycle this time. He had managed to find a car so she could be more comfortable. Mrs. Collins sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the streets pass by through the window, lost in thought. By the time they arrived, the first light of dawn was breaking over the skyline. The building was simple, unassuming, but it felt warm, welcoming. Women moved about, some carrying bags, others speaking in hushed voices. It was a place for new beginnings. Keanu turned off the engine and looked at her. "Ready?" She let out a slow breath. "I don't know." "That's okay." He smiled. "We do this at your pace." She glanced at the entrance, then back at Keanu. And finally, she opened the car door and stepped out. Mrs. Collins walked slowly toward the entrance. Her fingers hovered over the door handle, hesitating. Keanu stood beside her. "One step at a time," he said. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then, finally, she stepped inside. The faint scent of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air. Framed messages of encouragement lined the walls. The space felt warmer than she had expected. But the discomfort was still there. She felt every glance that landed on her. Every voice murmuring in the background. A part of her wanted to turn around and leave before it was too late. But then, she looked to her side. Keanu was there. No rush. No pressure. Just waiting. She took a deep breath and took her first step forward. The community theater was alive with energy that afternoon. Children darted across the stage, their voices echoing through the high ceilings as they laughed, stumbled through their lines, and acted out scenes with the kind of unfiltered enthusiasm only young performers could bring. The air buzzed with excitement. An upcoming play was just a few weeks away, and the rehearsal space was filled with a mix of creativity, nervous anticipation, and the occasional outburst of giggles. Keanu moved through the lively chaos, crouching beside a boy struggling to project his voice. "Try it again," Keanu encouraged. "From your stomach, not your throat. Make them hear you in the back row." The boy took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and let out his line with newfound confidence. Keanu grinned, giving him a small nod of approval. But just as he was about to move to another student, someone caught his attention. Near the side door, standing just beyond the stage lights, he saw her. Mrs. Collins. But not the frail woman he had found that cold night on the streets. Not the one wrapped in a tattered blanket, hiding from the world. This was someone else. Someone stronger. Her once unruly hair was now neatly tied in a simple bun, no longer tangled with exhaustion. Her clothes were clean, well-kept, not extravagant, but put together in a way that made her look like herself again. She looked alive. A slow smile spread across Keanu's face. She caught his gaze, and after a moment of hesitation, walked toward him. "I think you tricked me, Reeves." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh yeah? How so?" Mrs. Collins crossed her arms, glancing at the stage where the children rehearsed. "You told me it was just a support center," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You didn't tell me it was also a place where I'd find myself again." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "Some things," he said, "you only discover along the way." Mrs. Collins let out a quiet sigh, a small shake of her head as if she couldn't believe it herself. "I never thought I'd work in theater again," she admitted, her voice softer now. Keanu's smile didn't fade. "But it was always in you." She turned to him then, eyes searching his for something she couldn't quite put into words. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, a small smile appeared on her lips, not forced, not hesitant, but real. A warmth flickered in her expression, a light that had once been dimmed by years of hardship but was now beginning to glow again. She turned back to the children on stage, her posture shifting, stepping forward into a role that had always belonged to her. "All right, everyone," she called out, her voice clear, commanding. I want to feel some real emotion in those lines. Let's make the audience believe it. The young actors straightened, their voices growing louder, their performances gaining new energy. And just like that, the stage came to life once more. Keanu crossed his arms, watching. She was back. Maybe not completely. Maybe there would still be hard days, moments of doubt, struggles she had yet to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, she was truly there. Because sometimes, life doesn't offer second chances. But sometimes, all we need is someone who believes in us. If this story moved you, there are so many more waiting to be told, stories of hope, resilience, and the unexpected ways we find our way back to ourselves. Click the screen now to explore more stories that will warm your heart and remind you of the power of compassion.